In our last session, we briefly considered the philosophy of positivism as introduced through Auguste Comte. I thought it would be prudent to actually consider Immanuel Kant, the prodigious contributions coming from Immanuel Kant before we proceed any further. In a sense, in a very true sense, in order to understand any modern philosophy, we must understand the contributions coming through Kant. In simple terms, many of the modern and secular philosophies were born after the Kantian Revolution. In particular, pragmatism, phenomenology, pluralism, relativism, idealism, all sorts of isms that we find in our world really came by way of the Kantian Revolution. In our age, in particular in America, we tend to see the American Revolution as being the greatest revolution, at least the last few hundred years. But erudite and sound cultural historians have observed, and I'm of this belief as well, that the Kantian Revolution truly shaped the modern world. So I've entitled today, "You Can't Get There From Here," because I am ever so clever. You are so fortunate to be taught by someone like so clever, clever me. Because again, when we consider positivism, I tried to make the point that Kant really came after Kant, and so we remember his noumenal realm, or his noumenal world, essentially, and we can't get here. We can't get to the unknowable world of the eternal and transcendent from the phenomenal world. So you can't get there from here. So Immanuel Kant was born in 1724 and he died in 1804. He was from Königsberg of Prussia, and he didn't travel more than 100 miles from his home. But so he's somewhat of a simple man, and very little was expected from him. But he said that he was awakened from his dogmatic slumber from the works of David Hume. David Hume was very skeptical about empiricism. And so I'm going to have to paint with something of a broad brush. We have to really move through some things in order to encapsulate in a brief way what Kant contributed. So what he's known for is the transcendental method, okay? Essentially, this is the method through which he wants us to emerge to a greater understanding. If there is such a thing as knowledge, essentially, what are the means through which we can actually attain knowledge? Now, historically, when two affluent or able philosophers are at a disagreement, this gives way to a great amount of skepticism, a great culture of skepticism. With Parmenides and Heraclitus, when they couldn't agree, this gave way to a great period of skepticism, and really until Socrates and Plato. And then when Plato and Aristotle couldn't agree, essentially, and nobody can synthesize them until really later, Augustine's work through Christianity was Plato and Aristotle synthesized, that again gave way to skepticism. So essentially, what we had after David Hume were two parties really at absolute odds: the rationalists and the empiricists. Okay, so you have in philosophy a priori, which means before experience. Many people think this means before birth. This is knowledge that we have before experience. A posteriori is knowledge that we attain through experience. So the transcendental method, in simple terms, is basically, instead of taking either position, he transcends the problem. In other words, is it either a priori or a posteriori? He decided what he was going to do is transcend the problem and essentially ask if knowledge can be attainable. If there is such a thing as knowledge, what are the necessary components? Okay, so that's the transcendental method. He's not really he really embraced both of these positions, the good parts of these positions. He he ridiculed and criticized many portions of either perspective, but he embraced the good parts of these perspectives. Now, his epistemology, isn't this fun? His epistemology is called a sausage grinder. Okay, so you see, first of all, good old patriot here, but you see that through the tunnel, okay, you put the stuff in the tunnel and he churns it, and so it goes through this part and comes out in order to case it as a sausage. So his epistemology is seen as you basically throw things into the funnel, and then through the process of this other funnel comes out knowledge. Okay, so I have a very sophisticated diagram through which to show this. Okay, so here's the funnel. Okay, and so we first begin with sensations. This is in the phenomenal realm. This is the world of appearances. Okay, this is the world that we can taste, sense, and touch through our sense perception and so on. So what he called our perception of reality and in this world are called sensations. So you first start with putting sensations into the funnel. But do we have a direct perception of these little data bits? In other words, do we have an actual, real, solid foundation through which to perceive these sensations? So ultimately, this is a posteriori, okay? The sensations come through experience, but we must have categories of the mind in order to process these sensations. So he would say that there are such things as a priori knowledge. Ultimately, things such as the law of contradiction or the law of causality, but he says we don't really even perceive those. But we do naturally have these categories before we experience them. We might not have a comprehensive understanding as to the complexities that are involved in the very laws of the law of contradiction. In other words, you might not have studied logic and come to learn more about the law of contradiction and the law of causality and so on. But he said that these are a priori categories. These are examples of a priori categories through which we process the sensations. My wife is going to get mad at me because I'm not using this thing and still getting in the way. However, so first the sensations go into the funnel, okay? And then we have to process them a priori. This is the rational side of his epistemology. Obviously, this is the empirical side. Okay, so we have empiricism and we have rationalism. However, so we first start with our sensations, which works its way in through the categories of the mind, so that we can process these phenomena in time and space. We've been talking this whole time in this series about the fact that we live in time and space, and whereas there's an eternal and transcendent realm. Now, what is time? Do we ever perceive time, actually? A direct perception of time or space? My poor family has to endure with my philosophical nonsense every once in a while, so I get to have some fun with my poor family. And so I did raise the question with my wife, Sarah. I had an interesting conversation with my youngest, Jude. Anyway, people are trying to interrupt. Anyway, and he went on to time travel. And anyway, but do we ever have a concrete and direct perception of time? What is time? Essentially, we can't really process what is time. In other words, when somebody asks you, what time is it? How do you determine what time it is? You have to look at a clock. There has to be some sort of motion and matter. In other words, when you look at a clock, think about a traditional clock with hands. Okay, you first have, let me just draw it here. So you have a clock, and you got the 12 here, you got the 6 here, you got the hour hand, you got the minute hand, you got a little second hand here, okay. And it's working its way down. And so we can think of the second hand passing the 12 and working its way down and just anticipating it hitting the 6. And so before it hits the 6, we are anticipating the future while each second goes by into the past. And then it hits the 6 and it's gone. We can't fix the present. We are suspended between the past and the future. We can't freeze the present. So in a sense, we really can't perceive time without matter and without motion. Similarly, with space, if you were to ever perceive pure space, then you would be perceiving nothing, and nothing is imperceptible. So what he called, in order to, again, process the sensations through the categories of the mind, is what he called, now I have to go back to here and then touch that, pure intuitions. Okay, so through the category of the pure intuitions, we can understand space and time. Okay, so we first have the empiricism, we have rationalism, and then we have intuition, all mixed up in this sausage grinder. And then what comes out is knowledge. Okay, so this is the epistemology of Kant. Now, what he said was that rather than determining truth through that which corresponds to reality, he said truth is a judgment. Okay, now he distinguished between a few different kinds of judgment. Again, we return to a priori judgments and a posteriori judgments. Okay, so again, judgments that come before experience and judgments which come after experience. Now, in addition to this, correspondingly, this is why we took a little bit of time last week considering the analytical and synthetic. So, a priori would be the analytical method to understand knowledge, like we spoke about last week with the husband is a married man. So the husband in that sentence is the subject. A married man is the predicate. But you could switch the two and make a married man as the subject and the husband is the predicate, and it would be saying the same thing. So analytically, it's built into the definition. Synthetically, we showed that the category of a husband, let's talk about a rich husband. Again, the term rich isn't really built or found in the definition of husbandness. Okay, so we have to prove that through experience. We have to experience this husband. We have to see him, see how rich he is, and so on, in order to determine whether or not he is actually rich. Okay, so far so good, right? You have a priori, which is only found through the analytical method, essentially. But then you have a posteriori, which is found with the synthetic. Now, where it gets a little dicey for contemporary thinkers is that he said there are some synthetic knowledge that is a priori. He gave the example of the fact that we know the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. And we know that before experience. Now, again, this is an empirical thing. You know, in other words, we're talking about what would happen in time and space before it actually happens in time and space. Because a line really does, it refers to more direction. It's not necessarily a distance qualifier. Okay, but we know that before we experience it. And this is a huge means of debate in our day, especially with empiricists, because they say the only knowledge we can possibly have is synthetic knowledge, a posteriori, after experience. I mean, with contemporary scientists and contemporary philosophers, this is basically where we are. Okay, now the thing for which he's actually very much more well known, is his distinction between the phenomenal realm and the noumenal realm. Okay, since we considered the phenomenal realm in our last session, this is basically the world of appearances. Okay, this is the physical world. Up here is the noumenal realm. Now again, we're knowing these still through a priori and a posteriori categories. Okay, now in the noumenal realm, we remember that in the phenomenal realm, we have all the little data bits and so on, and which we know through sensations. Okay, however, in the noumenal realm, he has 3 different categories, essentially, or really ideas found in the noumenal realm, which we can't perceive, okay? They might be there, and he was a believer, so he definitely believes that these are true and real, we just can't know them. So the first is essences. This is an ontological referent. Okay, now, essentially, even the rationalist, someone like a Plato, and then somebody like Aristotle, who would be categorized more as an empiricist and so on, everybody still agreed that there was still a substratum of reality that existed beyond the physical realm. So whether you're a Platonist or whether you're an Aristotelian, you still had a substratum, a substance, essence, being that still undergird these things. But ultimately, Kant said, that might be true, but we just can't know this. In other words, when we see a tree, we only perceive the qualities of the tree. We can't perceive tree-ness. Again, he doesn't deny that it's real. He doesn't deny that it's true. He just says we can't perceive it. We can't perceive the tree-ness of the tree. We can only perceive the tree. It's much like the distinction of Aristotle, distinguishing between substance and accidents and so on. However, so the realm, the idea of essences is unknowable or imperceivable is probably the better way of putting it. Because again, all our knowledge is confined here. So we can't, the phenomenal realm. I need to be better at this because I understand people actually listen to this on podcasts and so on, and they don't have the visual. However, so down here in the world of the phenomenal realm, we just can't know the existence or what is the being of the thing. And in science and in attaining knowledge, if we can't know it, then ultimately we should not really be all that concerned with it. Okay. Secondly is the idea of the self. Now, he was actually rather convinced about the knowledge of the self. So in simple terms, René Descartes really came out with the motto cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. And ultimately, Kant said, well, that's interesting, and I don't really deny that, but ultimately what he said Descartes was doing is assuming a relationship between, a causal relationship between his thinking and his being. But even though he could perceive himself as thinking and understanding that he is a self, but even though he can understand that he can perceive himself thinking, he still could not perceive himself as a being. So what he termed, insofar, because we have to know ourselves as a self in order to perceive anything, in order to attain knowledge and everything, but we just can't know the being of the self. So he came out with the transcendental apperception of the ego. Right? Isn't that fun? See, this is why people don't really love reading philosophy or Immanuel Kant, because Kant seems somewhat fond of making up new terms. But ultimately, what he means by the transcendental apperception of the ego, ultimately, again, we cannot perceive the self. So there's a necessary apperception that must be assumed, which transcends the phenomenal realm. It transcends our normal way of knowing. Does that make sense? Okay. Most importantly, okay, so we have the idea of essences, we have the idea of the self in this noumenal realm, unknowable. More importantly, the idea of God, okay? Now, again, Kant was a believer. He just didn't believe we can get there from here. This is where he really laid his axe at the classical synthesis, really developed through Thomas Aquinas, okay? Where you basically have the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, and the moral argument. Now, for our purposes, we're going to keep the moral, eventually, the moral, okay, that's not working. We're going to keep the moral argument because he actually embraces the moral argument, okay? But essentially, the teleological argument is an argument from design. Okay, we see so much design out there. So the classical synthesis is essentially finding our world, finding reality where we are, and working our way back or up into the noumenal. Okay, but the teleological argument is, again, an argument from design. We see so much design out there, it just screams for a designer. But Kant, in his epistemology, for example, how can we perceive, or how can we differentiate between music and noise? What Kant is saying is through the categories of the mind, we can actually distinguish between music and noise. But the question is, the ultimate question is that because there is actually order out there? Is it because there's actually music? There is such a thing as a difference between music and noise out there. Or is it all utter chaos and cacophony until I perceive it and bring order to the chaos and cacophony through my perceptions and so on? So in other words, just because we perceive design, does that mean that there's actually design out there? Or as we're perceiving the world as it is, we are, again, assuming something that may or may not be. Simply put, what he's arguing is we just can't know. Again, he's not denying these. He's just agnostic as to how much knowledge we can actually know about it. Another is the cosmological argument, and these must be distinguished, the ontological and the cosmological argument. The cosmological argument is essentially an argument from cause. Okay, we see all the effects out there, and obviously necessitates a cause and so on. But in the time that we have, I really want to spend, because ultimately what he said is these arguments ultimately boil down to the ontological argument. So the being, again, we can't know essences, we can't know the self. And so obviously we can't understand the eternal and great and transcendent being in the noumenal realm, okay? So ultimately what he's arguing, to put this simply, is the ontological argument. Anselm of Canterbury, okay, around the 11th century, said that God was the greatest being whose being is necessary. And without this being, there would be nothing. And a man named Gallo said, okay, well, I have a conception of the greatest conceivable island, but that doesn't mean that that island exists. And Anselm responded to him saying that, well, we're not talking about islands. We're talking about the greatest conceivable being. So if you're talking about an island, then, or if you're not, if you're talking about a being that can or cannot exist, then you're not actually talking about the same thing I'm talking about. But ultimately, Kant did the same thing. He gave the illustration of, just to make it simple, $100. Okay, you have the idea of $100 and you have the reality of $100. And essentially, the existence is superfluous. The $100 is $100, whether it's an idea or a reality. So essentially, what he's saying is the existence of God is rather inconsequential in this paradigm. Okay, again, I want to stress the fact that he was a believer. Okay, but again, we just can't know this. That's all. That's all he's saying here. Okay, but he was convinced with the moral argument, which I hope to have a little bit of time to discuss briefly. But again, as we're flying through this, I want to take a little bit of time and consider here for a moment. As Christians, manifestly, if Kant is right, then Paul is wrong. In the first chapter of Romans, Paul says God is known. God reveals himself. So, in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 23 reads, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man." Now, for our purposes, I really just want to focus on a few things here. First of all, he says this is known of God and it's manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. In general revelation, in theology, we distinguish between general revelation and special revelation. General revelation is revelation of God through his created order, but through the created things. the things that he made, okay? Now that this is manifest in us and it's manifest to us. This is the distinction between mediate and immediate revelation, okay? So mediate is to them, through mediums, okay? So through the medium of the creation and so on. But he's also manifested in us through the conscience and so on. So necessarily, the problem isn't knowledge. The problem is the problem is not that people don't know God. The problem is that they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. They don't want there to be a God. And if you think about it, if you think about our secular world, how much they despise when we talk of sin. And they think that we're the judges, we're so judgmental and so on. They can't. It strikes their conscience, and so they must suppress it for a lie. In addition to this, though, so again, they suppress the truth in unrighteousness, professing to be wise. Think about the sages of our age. Think about all the learned men and women and so on. They profess to be wise, and they have become the most tragic of fools because they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible men. Again, they say, oh, we need to break that wall. Sorry. They say that all of reality is here with mankind. They have changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man. So ultimately, Kant has built an impenetrable wall. This wall is so high you can't get over it, so low you can't dig under it, so wide you can't get around it, and so thick you can't get through it. It's a fixed wall, so we must break it down. There we go. Okay, now what I want to say here is that Jesus Christ is the true Joshua. If we remember the story of Jericho, when all the walls of Jericho came tumbling down, that was a fortress of enemies. What Kant is attempting to do, and has been largely successful, is building a hedge around us, around our access to God. And all I want to say is that God has revealed himself to us. In simple terms, even if, and I argue this point, I firmly believe we can understand the things of the noumenal realm within the phenomenal realm, but that's something we will consider as this series progresses. But this wall has been broken by the blood of the Lamb. The true Joshua has broken this wall asunder. The God-man came to this time and to this space where we can perceive him. This is what John said, so we can perceive the glory of the only begotten Son of God. So he has revealed himself. God has been pleased at sundry times and in various ways to speak to creation, to his creatures, and most especially in and through his Son. Now, in the time that we have, which we're going to have to breeze through, again, his critique of the classical synthesis can be found in his very well-known book, A Critique of Pure Reason. But people leave out the fact that he wrote a book after that entitled A Critique of Practical Reason. In that, he basically argued that we must live as if there is a God. As Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, then all things are permissible. Now, essentially, I don't have time to get into all the details with this perspective. God willing, I will at some point. But right now, again, let me just condense it and say, for all practical purposes, we must live as though there is a God. Basically, this is the category of the categorical imperatives, okay, where everybody has a sense of oughtness. In simple terms, a sense of right and wrong. And essentially, there must be a judge between this right and wrong. But we see in our world how corrupt judges are, how sometimes justice actually isn't meted out on this side. So if there is such a thing as morality, again, he transcends the problem. And he says, if there is a such thing as morality, what are the necessary contingencies, for that to exist? Well, first, you need an afterlife. People need to live beyond this life. Okay, so you got to survive the grave, essentially. But then, even in addition to that, there must be a judgment. Okay, in order to cipher out the good and the bad and so on. Not only that, you need a perfect judge. You need a judge who knows all of the different criteria, right? I mean, with our justice system, we have fallible judges, and so they are not omniscient. They don't know everything. So we need a perfect, all-knowing judge. Okay, but this judge also has to be absolutely righteous, incapable of corruption. Because you could pay off a judge in this life. So not long after his moral imperative, his moral argument, we are left with, we find again an eternal, transcendent, omnipotent, omniscient God. So where God basically shut God out of the philosopher's house in the front end, he basically ran to the back of the house to try to sneak him in here. Now, again, so what his argument is, though, through the moral argument, his moral argument is that for all practical purposes, we must live as though there is a God. In fact, toward the closing of his book, A Critique of Pure Reason, he said, in other words, belief in a God and in another world is so interwoven with my moral sentiment that as there is little danger of my losing the latter, there is equally little cause for fear that the former can ever be taken from me. So again, essentially through the moral argument, and this is left out through many philosophies. I mean, Marxism claims Kant is their father. Democratic governments also claim Kant as their father and so on, because they leave out this moral framework. But again, though, it's important to recognize that as he sought to destroy the classical synthesis, he developed his moral argument pragmatically. So practically speaking. However, the generation just after him, the Nietzsches of the world, said, well, then morality is meaningless. Okay? So it really doesn't matter for all practical purposes. Well, for all practical purposes, God doesn't exist. And so it really doesn't matter how practical it would be if we were to live and pretend as though there is a God who doesn't exist. And that's where we are now. We're somewhat suspended between the idea of meaning and the idea of meaningless. We're just suspended in midair, floating along. And so it is the Christian's duty, it is the Christian's responsibility, and it should be our prerogative to tear this wall down, or to at least show that this wall was never built in the first place. We are suppressing this truth for a lie. And Kant, for as prodigious as his works are, and as you can conceive these things and perceive these things through his sausage grinder and so on, you can see, I hope to show through the course of this series the fallacies of his philosophy and of this worldview. But again, I really think people have misconstrued his thoughts, or at least been very selective as to what they embrace or accept and what they deny and reject. So again, I thought it would be prudent to consider Immanuel Kant before we continue. This is somewhat of a bridge between the things of which we have already spoken, including existentialism. This gave way to existentialism as well, pragmatism and the like, before we move into pluralism and or relativism, which is definitely a child of Kant.